988,527,192 times 9,077,006 equals 8,972,867,200, 369,910,864 times 875,491,824 equals 323,837,040,775,936. 89,502,480 times 10 million equals 895,024,800,000,000. 3,150,190 times 900 million equals 2,835,171,000,000,000. 30,000 times 380,108,964 equals 11,403,268,920,000. 839,242,382 times 553,257,447 equals 464,317,097,679,518,754. 556,539,532 times 500,000 equals 278,269,766,000,000. 100,400,009 times 900 million 22 equals 90,360,000,000 10,308,800,198. 200,000 times 90,290 equals 18,058,000,000. 78,531,700 times 859,075,074 equals 67,464,625,988,845,800. 945,600,577 times 158,556,157 equals 149,793,546,102,589. 492,355,647 times 884,548,715 equals 435,500. 12,554,876,843,605. 82,967,618 times 150,117,355 equals 12,454,800. 79,364,810,390. 955,878,358 times 20,270 equals 19,117,825,200. 47,156,660. 540,803,000 times 41,004,000 equals 22,175,086,212,000,000. 862,816,777 times 731,271,507 equals 630,324,781,672,939. 5,589,385 times 912,693,186 equals 5,101,393,603,430,610. 844,821,237 times 738,281,498 equals 623,715,888,394. 1,573,026. 25,158,035 times 240,042,269 equals 6,038,991,804,981,415. 95,490,742 times 1,452,401 equals 138,690,849,171,542. 94,509 times 550,909,080 equals 51,785,733,932,721,720. 223,875,171 times 805,400,506 equals 180,309,176,004,236,500. 26. 906 times 100,695 equals 91,229,670. 778,479,542 times 50,200,139 equals 39,79,781,217,056,338. 115 million times 400,080 equals 46,9,200,000,000. 560,550 times 3,262,582 equals 1,828,840,340,100. 497,621,234 times 5,985 equals 2,978,263,085,490. 7,401,310 times 2,075 equals 15,357,718,250. 90,570,095 times 3,165,383 equals 286,689,039,021,385. 665,392,594 times 22 equals 14,638,637,068. 46,184,445 times 100,000 equals 4,618,444,500,000. 71,093,003 times 300 million equals 21,327,900,900,000,000. 926,407 times 592,439,835 equals 548,840,410,222,845. 6,708,350 times 94,481,845 equals 633,817,284,905,750. 20,204,600 times 940,100 equals 18,994,344,460,000. 146,381,675 times 127,819,293 equals 18 quadrillions 710 trillion 402,206,655,775. 576,475 times 697,011,505 equals 401,809,707,344,875. 792,930,132 times 701,040,200 equals 555 quadrillion 875 trillion 898,323,306,400. 80,043,159 times 687,193,556 equals 55 quadrillion 5,143 billion 66,683,404. 824,107,036 times 163,921,117 equals 135 quadrillion 88 trillion 545,868,679,212. 17,394,254 times 408,361,006 equals 7 quadrillion 103 trillion 135 billion 62,059,524. 250,004,010 times 855,573,445 equals 213 quadrillion 896 trillion 792 billion 99,514,400. 50. 781,343,123 times 928,779,915 equals 725 quadrillion 695 trillion 799 billion 300. 65,774,545. 400,655,000 times 660,408,201 equals 264 quadrillion 595 trillion 847 billion 771,655,000. 200 million times 80 million 80 equals 16 quadrillion 16 billion. 463,332,049 times 676,337,315 equals 313 quadrillion 368 trillion 753 billion 974 million 108,435. 10 million times 247,780,436 equals 2 quadrillion 477 trillion 804 billion 360 million. 4,305,702 times 780,898,549 equals 3 quadrillion 362 trillion 316 billion 444,226,300. 98. 42,820 times 291,637 equals 12,487,896,340. 263,415,039 times 601,000,000 8 equals 158 quadrillion 312 trillion 440 billion 546,320,312. 867,706,096 times 950,072,006 equals 824 quadrillion 383 trillion 271 billion 245,148,500. 76. 3,469,288 times 57,572,718 equals 199 trillion 736 billion 300 39,684,784. 950,202,249 times 55,254,429 equals 52 quadrillion 502 trillion 882 billion 703,010,821. 600,300 times 300,079,000 equals 180 trillion 137 billion 423,700,000. 632,000 times 80,700 equals 51 billion 2,400,000. 3,852,013 times 9,187 equals 35 billion 388,443,431. 64,000 times 785,678,465 equals 50 trillion 283 billion 421,760,000. 935,898,676 times 52,900,600 equals 49 quadrillion 509 trillion 601 billion 499,605,600. 18,088,100 times 208,006 equals 3 trillion 762 billion 433,328,600. 251,934,670 times 400,107,005 equals 100 quadrillion 800 trillion 826 billion 269,363,350. 578,746,620 times 559,664,000 equals 323 quadrillion 903 trillion 648 billion 335 million 680,000. 94,739 times 3 equals 284,217. 400,050 times 928,515,200 equals 371 quadrillion 406 trillion 126 billion 425,760,000. 983,270,864 times 950,175,771 equals 934 quadrillion 280 trillion 151 billion 303,036,144. 260,090,100 times 10,020 equals 2 quadrillion 600 trillion 906 billion 201,802,000. 34,109 times 7,704,194 equals 262 billion 782,353,146. 548,235,932 times 363,011,200 equals 199 quadrillion 15 trillion 783 billion 558,438,400. 13,067 times 70,949,830 equals 922 trillion 352 billion 543,638,610. 834,871,193 times 57,417,178 equals 47,935,553,895,553,354. 159,528,899 times 165,699,461 equals 26,433,852,578,223,439. 64,647,828 times 6 equals 387,886,968. 25,263,878 times 654,249,773 equals 16,528,886,446,500,99,694. 378,731,961 times 10,401,011 equals 3,939,195,292,412,571. 70 million times 900,632,701 equals 63,44,289,070 million. 6,630,120 times 601,751,180 equals 3,989,682,533,541,600. 19,783 times 825,124,208 equals 16,323,432,206,864. 8,798,730 times 29,933,883 equals 263,380,154,368,590. 7,612 times 596,946,524 equals 4,543,956,940,688. 563,736,317 times 6,860,072 equals 3,767,271,723,634,824. 50,800,040 times 702,007 equals 35,661,628,435,600,280. 41,558,727 times 29 equals 1,205,203,083. 5,800 times 722,491 equals 4,190,447,800. 25,917,596 times 760,563,941 equals 19,711,988,955,005,836. 563,600,750 times 167,577,532 equals 94,446,822,718,349,000. 261,710,626 times 349,422,922 equals 91,447,691,655,369,172. 75,296 times 8,184,061 equals 616,227,057,056. 5,764,864 times 37,227,523 equals 214,611,600. 7,151,800. 72. 603,700,609 times 1,056,051 equals 637,538,631,800. 35,059. 7,634 times 759,113,006 equals 5,795,068,687,804. 49 times 165,943 equals 8,131,207. 668,351,525 times 876,524,928 equals 585,800,800. 26,772,329,315,200. 117,987,831 times 563,022,770 equals 66,429,835,435,911,800. 70. 512,433,743 times 97,540,113 equals 49,982,800. 45,197,200. 32,959. 151,113,030 times 8,810,007 equals 1,331,306,852,091,210. 724,399,374 times 3,400,000 8 equals 2,462,963,666,794,992. 601,800,000 times 230,200,000 equals 138,534,360,000. 67,533,745 times 60,706,000 2 equals 4,99,703,659,037,490. 36,624 times 73,772,453 equals 2,701,842,318,672. 908 times 9,352,419 equals 8,491,996,452. 5,022 times 1,460 equals 7,332,120. 310,038,229 times 30,640 equals 9,499,571,336,500. 60. 421,067,058 times 639 equals 269,061,850,062. 994,020 times 678,070,506 equals 674,015,644,374,120. 608 million times 9002 equals 5,473,216,000,000. 72,058,294 times 67,634,767 equals 4,873,645,925,107,400. 98. 90,000 times 74,004,003 equals 6,660,360,270,000. 952,748,057 times 791,657,741 equals 754,200. 50,374,500. 46,759,237. 93,294 times 3,532 equals 329,514,408. 915,207,980 times 231,501,545 equals 211,872,061,366,329,100. 464,480,882 times 928,277,085 equals 431,166,000,000. 959,181,100. 88,970. 238,178,424 times 40,665,057 equals 9,685,539,188,130,168. 75,790,526 times 75,736 equals 5,740,071,277,136. 5,569,751 times 6,461,199 equals 35,987,269,591,449. 8,096 times 689 equals 5,578,144. 730,020,000 times 33,752,122 equals 24,639,724,100. 2,440,000. 800 million times 800 million 8,000 equals 640 quadrillion 6,400,000,000,000. 544,204,323 times 288,187 equals 156,832,611,000,000. 232,401. 742,505,403 times 50 equals 37,125,270,150. 911,715,457 times 813,567,979 equals 741 quadrillion 700. 42,501,700. 74,551,403. 905,401,084 times 811,413,122 equals 734 quadrillion 654,300. 20,230,624,248. 109,106,000 times 20 equals 2,182,120,000. 8,006,002 times 7,940 equals 63,567,655,880. 117,406 times 291,000 equals 34,165,146,000. 999,199,632 times 430,003,227 equals 429 quadrillion 659 trillion 66,177,212,400. 64. 65,667,060 times 730,130,582 equals 47 quadrillion 945,528,736,028,920. 245,303,278 times 562,991,649 equals 138 quadrillion 103,696,900. 86,325,422. 500,077,093 times 478,341,788 equals 239 quadrillion 207,700,000,700. 70,803,462,284. 379,154,775 times 5 equals 1,895,773,875. 3,090 times 7,098,889 equals 21,297,305,900,010. 60,030 times 2,006 equals 120,060,360,180. 499,625,757 times 892,426,477 equals 445 quadrillion 879,254,100. 37,968,089. 15,753 times 180,707,591 equals 2,846,686,681,023. 10 million times 600,800 equals 6 quadrillion 8 billion. 487,339,782 times 407,572,694 equals 198 quadrillion 600. 26,387,843,100. 12,708. 9,100,340 times 550,462 equals 5,9,391,357,080. 82,205,162 times 5,317,959 equals 437,163,681,104,358. 56,153,376 times 817,824,213 equals 45 quadrillion 923,590,534,493,088. 1,936,641 times 58,067,215 equals 112,455,349,324,815. 441,681 times 2 equals 883,362. 175,943,179 times 10 equals 1,759,431,790. 978,349,773 times 71,313 equals 69,769,057,361,949. 7,027,466 times 13,211 equals 92,839,853,326. 201 million times 620,300 equals 124 quadrillion 620 trillion 60 billion 300 million. 50,485,010 times 182,555,213 equals 9 quadrillion 216 trillion 301 billion 753,857,130. 7,168,143 times 868,374,418 equals 6 quadrillion 224 trillion 632 billion 5,765,774. 7,955,630 times 588,296,504 equals 4 quadrillion 680 trillion 269 billion 316,117,500. 20. 300,000 times 800 million equals 240 trillion. 918,334,591 times 800,504,000 equals 735 quadrillion 130 trillion 513 billion 433,864,000. 802,773,701 times 40,666,459 equals 32 quadrillion 645 trillion 963 billion 797,994,759. 240,900,200 times 62,050,320 equals 14 quadrillion 947 trillion 934 billion 498,064,000. 92,172,936 times 28,241,336 equals 2 quadrillion 603 trillion 86 billion 855,682,496. 86,420,637 times 300,600,999 equals 25 quadrillion 978 trillion 129 billion 816,416,363. 23,800,036 times 600 million equals 14 quadrillion 280 trillion 21 billion 600 million. 6,900,096 times 109,043,439 equals 752 trillion 410 billion 197,270,144. 903,140,045 times 388,004,592 equals 350 quadrillion 422 trillion 484 billion 679,086,600. 40. 49,064 times 170,006,934 equals 8 trillion 341 billion 220,209,776. 616,624,258 times 631,644,062 equals 389 quadrillion 487 trillion 51 billion 50,855,996. 2,912,174 times 727,554,676 equals 2 quadrillion 118 trillion 765 billion 811,025,600. 24. 785,280,006 times 630,223,039 equals 494 quadrillion 901 trillion 551 billion 847,258,234. 447,560,789 times 603,930,001 equals 270 quadrillion 295 trillion 387 billion 748,330,700. 89. 40 million times 764,532,020 equals 30 quadrillion 581 trillion 280 billion 800 million. 5,445,873 times 4,010,209 equals 21 trillion 839 billion 88,917,457. 294,148,056 times 9,744,000 equals 2 quadrillion 866 trillion 178 billion 600. 57,664,000. 12,267 times 860,012,806 equals 10 trillion 549 billion 777,091,202. 617,583,345 times 44,110,933 equals 27 quadrillion 242 trillion 177 billion 553,210,800. 85. 147,666,986 times 90,608,138 equals 13 quadrillion 379 trillion 800. 30,645,532,068. 767,859,291 times 213,257,494 equals 163 quadrillion 751 trillion 748 billion 143,276,754. 130,084 times 26,639,863 equals 3 quadrillion 463 trillion 184 billion 427,748,492. 1,308 times 7,003 equals 9,159,924. 708,400 times 83,652,115 equals 59 trillion 259 billion 158,266,000. 330,610,090 times 20,000 2 equals 6 trillion 612 billion 863,020,180. 789,280 times 37,590,255 equals 29 trillion 669 billion 236,466,400. 372,081,505 times 414,195,737 equals 154 quadrillion 114 trillion 573 billion 187,544,185. 6 million times 176,565,424 equals 1 quadrillion 59,392,544,000,000. 520 times 60,300,000 equals 31,356,000,000. 1,500,000 times 800,000,000 equals 800,400,000,000,000. 90,238,031 times 682,896,228 equals 61 quadrillion 623,210,000,000 992,047,068. 90,897,834 times 26,097,152 equals 2 quadrillion 372,174,000,000 590,368,768. 5,140 times 920 equals 4,600,128,800. 787,622,992 times 864,751,118 equals 681 quadrillion 97,862,894,505,056. 23,503,107 times 783,390,505 equals 18 quadrillion 412,110,000,000 861,799,035. 81 times 600 million equals 48,600,000,000. 51,717,062 times 35,547,889 equals 1 quadrillion 838,432,000,000 379,382,100. 18. 96,020 times 60,005,002 equals 5,761,680,292,040. 795 times 5,598 equals 4,450,410. 300,071 times 9 million equals 2,700,639,000,000. 308,823,967 times 57,695,719 equals 17 quadrillion 817,820,820,497,273. 1,251,584 times 297,765,935 equals 372,679,079,991,040. 2 times 54,230 equals 108,460. 657,389 times 5,008,000 equals 3,292,204,112,000. 80 times 80,082,320 equals 6,406,585,600. 60,007,005 times 10,000,000 equals 600,070,050,000,000. 9,619 times 597 equals 5,742,543. 11 times 79,815,742 equals 877,973,162. 8,088,644 times 600,200 equals 4 quadrillion 853,188,017,728,800. 24,192,546 times 61,558,837 equals 1 quadrillion 489,264,995,829,002. 61,080 times 700 million equals 42,756,000,000. 700,026,408 times 21,613 equals 15,129,670,756,104. 6,040,631 times 20,370,773 equals 123,052,322,800. 77,763. 14,526 times 5,004 equals 72,688,104. 8,211,387 times 618,694,672 equals 5 quadrillion 80,341,386,630,064. 206,077,066 times 8,666 equals 1,785,863,853,956. 559,782,934 times 15,613,580 equals 8 quadrillion 740,215,000,000 622,643,720. 999,806,192 times 674,968,339 equals 674 quadrillion 837,524,736. 1,155,088. 10,666,416 times 170,939,726 equals 1 quadrillion 823,300. 14,228,442,016. 3,093,685 times 30,506,605 equals 94,377,826,289,425. 55,261,094 times 546,270 equals 30,187,477,819,380. 431,552,379 times 7,543,092 equals 3 quadrillions 255,239,297,615,800. 68. 41,292,237 times 506,820,842 equals 20 quadrillion 927,700. 66,324,403,500. 54. 186,235,559 times 5,436,075 equals 1 quadrillion 12,390,400. 66,390,925. 916,744,591 times 780,082,729 equals 715 quadrillion 136,622,343,200. 68,839. 600,800,070 times 9,554,552 equals 5 quadrillion 740 trillion 375 billion 510 418,640. 30,115,544 times 7,315,246 equals 220 trillion 302 billion 612 million 783,824. 103,000 times 73,010 equals 7,520,000 30,000. 491,854 times 3,171,149 equals 1,559,742,320,246. 5 times 408,016,002 equals 2,040,080,010. 7,408,076 times 60,133,238 equals 445,471,597,230,088. 90 million times 400 million equals 36 quadrillion. 961,600 times 7,718,357 equals 7,421,972,091,200. 56,563,943 times 830,390,932 equals 46 quadrillion 970,185,345,364,876. 9,686,687 times 395,055,123 equals 3 quadrillion 826 trillion 775,324,247,500. 1. 10 million times 4,401 equals 44 billion 10 million. 824,395 times 49,313,165 equals 40 trillion 653,526,660,175. 89,411,498 times 475,766,285 equals 42 quadrillion 538 trillion 976,239,700. 44,930. 911,183,126 times 97,607 equals 88 trillion 937,851,379,482. 592,692 times 2,745,628 equals 1 trillion 627,311,750,576. 935,854,435 times 721,188 equals 674 trillion 926,988,268,700. 80. 33,127,956 times 100,800 equals 3 trillion 339,297,964,800. 20 million times 500 million 80,419 equals 10 quadrillion 1 trillion 608,380,000,000. 582,495 times 51,796,768 equals 30 trillion 171,358,376,160. 80 million times 30,000 equals 2 trillion 400 billion. 37,116,457 times 6,830,604 equals 321 trillion 833,859,650,028. 82,884,496 times 255,162,911 equals 21 quadrillion 149 trillion 49,276,127,856. 40,517,899 times 39,680 equals 1 trillion 607,750,232,320. 807,210,386 times 158 equals 127,539,240,988. 842,556 times 8,238,410 equals 6 trillion 941,321,775,960. 400 million 5 times 8,000 equals 3 trillion 200,040,000. 9,882,756 times 900 million 3 equals 8 quadrillion 894,480,429,648,268. 584,857,177 times 87,148,667 equals 50 quadrillion 969 trillion 523,360,900 33,059. 70 million times 900,080 equals 63 trillion 5,600,000,000. 633,305,446 times 363,123,566 equals 229 quadrillion 968 trillion 131,900. 18,740,436. 262,836,972 times 970,758,467 equals 255 quadrillion 151 trillion 216,009,641,924. 70,938,415 times 249,670,595 equals 17 quadrillion 711 trillion 236,281,406,900. 25. 860,391,050 times 394,084,264 equals 339 quadrillion 66 trillion 573,691,437,200. 95,311,770 times 681,802,067 equals 64 quadrillion 983 trillion 761,795,428,500. 90. 38,967,567 times 987,978,282 equals 38 quadrillion 499 trillion 109,898,379,894. 567,790,014 times 908,629,019 equals 515 quadrillion 910 trillion 483,418,816,200. 66. 985,204,751 times 814,846,513 equals 802 quadrillion 790 trillion 655,943,383,263. 40 million times 106,005,009 equals 4 quadrillion 240 trillion 200 billion 360 million. 300 million 70,000 times 70 million equals 21 quadrillion 4 trillion 900 billion. 586,200,700 times 91,006,000 equals 53 quadrillion 347 trillion 780 billion 904,200,000. 943,605,387 times 72,730,312 equals 68 quadrillion 628 trillion 714,201,390,700. 44. 400 million 3 times 66,090,800 equals 26 quadrillion 436 trillion 320 billion 198,272,400. 503,704 times 565,334,080 equals 284 trillion 761 billion 37,432,320. 800,700,000 times 50,106,260 equals 40 quadrillion 120 trillion 82 billion 382 million. 73 times 673,824,045 equals 49,189,155,285. 34,970,547 times 55,946,459 equals 1 quadrillion 956 trillion 478,273,943,073. 693,264,528 times 23,000 equals 15 trillion 945 billion 84,144,000. 50 million times 683,002,060 equals 34 quadrillion 150 trillion 103 billion. 119,937,512 times 78,859,410 equals 9 quadrillion 458 trillion 201 billion 433,187,900. 20. 60 million times 60,500,050 equals 3 quadrillion 630 trillion 3 billion. 60,050,000 times 500 million equals 30 quadrillion 25 trillion. 2,688,210 times 704,460,007 equals 1 quadrillion 893 trillion 736 billion 435,417,470. 500,597 times 900,007 equals 450 quadrillion 540 billion 800,004,179. 804,008 times 682,912,421 equals 549 quadrillion 61 trillion 591 billion 947,299,368. 6,796,072 times 435,743,118 equals 2 quadrillion 961 trillion 341 billion 603,432,400. 96. 977,843,370 times 245,000 equals 239 trillion 571 billion 625 million 650,000. 316,329,647 times 99,511,362 equals 31 quadrillion 478 trillion 394 billion 13,949,214. 45 times 530,717,803 equals 23 billion 882,301,135. 428 times 7,409 equals 3,171,052. 178,932,344 times 493,946,282 equals 88 quadrillion 382 trillion 966 billion 48,345,008. 330,957 times 76,983,832 equals 25 trillion 478 billion 338,087,224. 700,009,200 times 749,957,828 equals 524 quadrillion 977 trillion 379,212,017,600. 20,365,392 times 953,448,668 equals 19 quadrillion 417 trillion 355,875,697,856. 108,070,588 times 995,814,095 equals 107 quadrillion 618 trillion 214 billion 785,337,800. 60. 9 times 6,040 equals 54,360. 100,108 times 4,284,121 equals 428 trillion 412 billion 562,685,068. 918,790,662 times 605,004,479 equals 555 quadrillion 872 trillion 465 billion 773,375,098. 980,517 times 65 equals 63,733,605. 32,050,600 times 1,827,271 equals 58 trillion 565 billion 131,912,600. 7,862,110 times 209,002 equals 1 trillion 643 billion 196,714,220. 609,207,788 times 10,007,000 equals 6 quadrillion 96 trillion 342 billion 334,500,000. 16,000. 69,207,452 times 1,304,313 equals 90 trillion 268 billion 179,340,476. 440,206 times 850,045,598 equals 374 trillion 195 billion 172,513,188. 70 million times 800 million equals 56 quadrillion. 865,215,175 times 601,748,170 equals 520 quadrillion 641,648,212,479,750. 980,502,330 times 181,144,800 equals 177 quadrillion 612 trillion 898,467,384,000. 59 times 445 equals 26,255. 200,010,000 times 708,659,272 equals 141 quadrillion 738 trillion 940,992,720,000. 257,672 times 313,958 equals 80,898,185,776. 5,032,440 times 2 equals 10,064,880. 1,000,000 times 80,600,000 equals 80 trillion 600 billion. 859,705,556 times 77,458,475 equals 66 quadrillion 591 trillion 481,316,700. 87,100. 96,500,609 times 3 equals 289,501,827. 397,292,202 times 17,673,348 equals 7 quadrillion 21,483,343,632,296. 679,300,431 times 397,156,971 equals 269 quadrillion 788 trillion 901,574,954,501. 338,249,366 times 772,839,721 equals 261 quadrillion 412 trillion 545,647,866,886. 323,151,289 times 5,143,943 equals 1 quadrillion 662 trillion 271,810,992,500. 27. 7,266,917 times 4,734,803 equals 34 trillion 407,420,400. 12,351. 7,813,338 times 330,007,020 equals 2 quadrillion 578 trillion 456,389,632,760. 888,437,803 times 16,910,248 equals 15 quadrillion 23 trillion 703,581,305,144. 29,598,393 times 54,952,582 equals 1 quadrillion 626 trillion 508,118,400,726. 306,692 times 600,800,079 equals 184 trillion 260,577,828,668. 429,787,790 times 886,121,832 equals 380 quadrillion 844 trillion 343,846,031,280. 10,500,101 times 533,422 equals 5 trillion 600,984,875,600. 22. 82,400,090 times 58,006,284 equals 4 quadrillion 779 trillion 723,022,165,560. 14,852,364 times 257,178,437 equals 3 quadrillion 819 trillion 707,759,275,068. 864,569,462 times 666,865,113 equals 576 quadrillion 551 trillion 211,900 972,979,206. 933,854,000 times 968,144,423 equals 904 quadrillion 105 trillion 541,996,242,000. 700,400,040 times 4 million equals 2 quadrillion 801 trillion 600 billion 160 million. 443,613,616 times 700,400 equals 310 trillion 706,976,646,400. 4,518,233 times 184,281,858 equals 832 trillion 628,372,116,914. 200,570 times 403,898,929 equals 80 quadrillion 780 trillion 16,022,389,530. 490,750,173 times 424,420,209 equals 208 quadrillion 284 trillion 290,991,446,157. 2,700,101 times 350,000,2005 equals 945 trillion 40,763,702,500. 5. 2,617,419 times 92,000 equals 240,802,548,000. 9,170,020 times 8,306 equals 76,166,186,120. 451,640,004 times 776,063,070 equals 350 quadrillion 501 trillion 128,039,052,280. 600,466,173 times 1,408,192 equals 845,571,600. 61,089,216. 2,266,261 times 78 equals 176,768,358. 20,009,080 times 66,663,946 equals 1,333,884,228,629,680. 1,624,234 times 5,826,000 equals 9,462,787,284,000. 197,932,229 times 79,268,773 equals 15,689,844,929,985,017. 700,004,080 times 811,287,386 equals 567,904,480,000,252,534,880. 17,543,423 times 479,123,490 equals 8,405,400. 66,054,306,270. 908,652,769 times 575,777,511 equals 523 quadrillion. 181,829,600. 98,077,959. 800,200 times 3,001 equals 2,401,400,200. 26,845,240 times 992,901,504 equals 26 quadrillion 654,600,. 79,171,240,960. 13,485,888 times 351,421,954 equals 4 quadrillion 739,200,. 37,112,385,152. 200,900,000 times 440,320,798 equals 88 quadrillion 460,448,318,200,000. 928,163,845 times 81,867,612 equals 75 quadrillion 986,557,534,888,140. 808,456,093 times 40,010,004 equals 32 quadrillion 346,331,514,754,372. 26,523,150 times 130,665,370 equals 3 quadrillion 465,600. 57,208,315,500. 881,472 times 930,602 equals 820,299,606,144. 953,490,182 times 78 equals 74,372,234,196. 200 million times 941,022,261 equals 188 quadrillion 204,452,200,000,000. 667,141,791 times 879,786,705 equals 586 quadrillion 942,478,071,688,655. 900,959,000 times 50 million equals 45 quadrillion 47,950,000,000,000. 6,100 times 8,850 equals 53,985,000. 269,758,969 times 781,372,513 equals 210 quadrillion 782,243,511,800. 19,097. 10,003 times 123,808,496 equals 1,238,456,385,488. 256,957,766 times 572,334,246 equals 147 quadrillion 65,729,257,454,436. 61,006,820 times 1,010,062 equals 61,620,670,622,840. 59,228,919 times 258,451,149 equals 15 quadrillion 307,700. 82,169,577,900. 31. 449,193,055 times 30,097,000 equals 13 quadrillion 519,363,376,335,000. 900 million times 5,163,700 equals 4 quadrillion 647,330,000,000,000. 4,570,001 times 501,298,624 equals 2 quadrillion 290,935,212,978,624. 5,020,000 times 10 equals 50,200,000. 839,626,559 times 578,177,392 equals 485 quadrillion 453,094,136,554,128. 55,123,231 times 6,172,131 equals 340,227,802,875,261. 45,565,221 times 1,035,456 equals 47,180,781,400. 75,776. 163,171,895 times 99,883,831 equals 16 quadrillion 298,200. 33,984,129,700. 45. 972,591,223 times 96,918 equals 94,261,596,150,714. 7,008 times 100,006,000 equals 700,842,048,000. 15,643,122 times 972,133,900 equals 15,207,209,198,035,800. 2,464,392 times 80,000,000 equals 197,151,360,000,000. 300,036,508 times 550,320,000 equals 165,116,091,082,560,000. 90,670,368 times 660 equals 59,842,442,880. 40,000,000 times 802,089,000 equals 32,83,560,000,000. 9,626,476 times 909,020,098 equals 8 to 750,660,100. 56,914,648. 108,565,030 times 219,125,472 equals 23,789,300. 63,441,444,160. 7,247,078 times 300,094,074 equals 2,174,805,161,615,772. 714,713,299 times 601,087,870 equals 429,605,494,556,500. 83,130. 630,961,348 times 623,328,543 equals 393,296,217,738. 1,155,964. 2 times 760,000 equals 1,520,000. 655,342,151 times 334,232,125 equals 219,36,000,000. 399,730,800,800. 75. 88,029,263 times 542,542,437 equals 47,759,610,875,333,900. 31. 808,000,000 2 times 90,000,000 equals 72,720,180,000,000. 38,072,753 times 573,297,162 equals 21,827,001,000,000. 244,426,900. 86. 33,021,403 times 821,000 equals 27,110,571,863,000. 701,120,990 times 305,337 equals 214,078,179,000. 723,630. 328,861,312 times 325,159,378 equals 106,339,658,183,936. 90,030,200 times 90,000 equals 8,102,718,000,000. 44,485,381 times 338,926,153 equals 15,77,259,047,069,293. 107,587,570 times 812,681,387 equals 87,434,415,611,500. 59,590. 1,073,101 times 700,055 equals 751,229,720,555. 741,285,876 times 6,760 equals 5,011,092,521,760. 396,947,379 times 83,337,399 equals 33,080,500. 62,105,727,200. 21. 609,800,080 times 9,285,833 equals 5,662,501,706,000,000. 266,640. 176,173,799 times 545,453,113 equals 96,094,000,000. 547,093,586,200. 87. 10 times 24,000 equals 240,000. 3,016,657 times 72,895,360 equals 219,900,298,011,520. 700,300 times 500,000,000 equals 350,150,000,000. 728,010,414 times 309,080,003 equals 225,13,460,943,000,151,242. 10,000 times 11,625 equals 116,250,000. 89,072,286 times 570,020,000 equals 50,772,984,465,000,000. 720,000. 706,000 times 455,050,054 equals 321,265,338,124,000. 90,402,030 times 70,080 equals 6,335,374,262,400. 1,987,393 times 5,701,720 equals 11,331,558,400,15,960. 115,050,149 times 803,927,525 equals 92 quadrillion, 491,981,536,400, 51,225. 11,060 times 670,980,853 equals 7,421,048,234,180. 857,579,671 times 5,593,860 equals 4,797,180,618,420,060. 90,000,000 times 495,030,000 2 equals 44,552,702,655,150,010. 3,705,106 times 90,000,000 40 equals 333,459,688,204,240. 608,090,214 times 3,204,803 equals 1 quadrillion 948,809,342,097,842. 10,901,507 times 9,038,648 equals 98,534,884,442,536. 9,902,311 times 476,393,521 equals 4 quadrillion 717,396,803,327,031. 813,382,734 times 959,182,639 equals 780 quadrillion 182,597,315,155,026. 605,400 times 8,771,393 equals 5 quadrillion 306,696,273,557,200. 5 million times 5,200,247 equals 26,1,235,000,000. 230,902,992 times 20 equals 4,618,059,840. 984,708,804 times 31,115,880 equals 30 quadrillion 640,080,980,207,520. 60,005 times 311,002,780 equals 18 quadrillion 660,168,355,013,900. 21,376,812 times 935,113,165 equals 19 quadrillion 989,700,38,326,929,900. 80. 411,155,787 times 20,211,839 equals 8 quadrillion 310,214,570,762,293. 409,103,703 times 781,435,391 equals 319 quadrillion 688,112,113,352,873. 246,871,194 times 701,760,005 equals 173 quadrillion 244,330,335,795,970. 26,501 times 76,000 equals 2,014,076,000. 500,803,024 times 556,986,615 equals 278 quadrillion 940,581,119,523,700. 60. 604,352 times 400,681,985 equals 242,152,958,998,720. 176,381,532 times 374,592,141 equals 66 quadrillion 71,135,704,740,012. 390,479,421 times 7,963,737 equals 3 quadrillion 109,675,412,700. 56,277. 81 times 6,673,719 equals 540,571,239. 8,034,800 times 608,570,303 equals 4 quadrillion 889,740,670,544,400. 900,080 times 971,000 equals 873,977,680,000. 955,967,670 times 29,872,673 equals 28 quadrillion 557,309,604,481,900. 10. 143,096,000 8 times 182,490,794 equals 26 quadrillion 113,704,118,150,352. 85,526,648 times 3,150 equals 269,408,941,200. 50,360 times 2 equals 100,720. 61,000 times 480,090 equals 29,285,490,000. 90 times 664,504,043 equals 59,805,363,870. 564,575,178 times 596,457,743 equals 336 quadrillion 745,236,423,703,254. 500 times 30,706,000 equals 15,353,000,000. 63,001,383 times 222,166,613 equals 13,996,803,875,425,700. 79. 869,029,500 times 113,486,829 equals 98,623,402,262,455,500. 50 million times 943,200,700 equals 47,160,035,000,000. 56,152,220 times 1,609,001 equals 90,348,978,132,220. 735,002,000 times 600,000 equals 441,1,200,000,000. 388,593 times 9,662,008 equals 3,754,588,674,744. 40,974,960 times 64,416,716 equals 2,639,472,361,431,360. 149,078,142 times 131,819,268 equals 19,651,371,553,240,056. 400,288,404 times 200 million equals 80,57,680,800,000,000. 7,900,779 times 649,091,040 equals 5,128,324,800. 57,920,160. 90 times 80,030,670 equals 7,202,760,300. 110,076,040 times 834 equals 91,803,417,360. 419,147,087 times 625,619,994 equals 262,226,798,054,057,400. 78. 193,004,843 times 166,723,360 equals 32,178,415,921,232,480. 1,900,000 times 70,030,000 equals 133,057,000,000. 440,064,981 times 13,752,155 equals 6,051,841,800. 28,784,055. 4,550 times 8,806 equals 40,067,300. 35,456,318 times 55,636,688 equals 1,972,672,102,194,700. 84. 626,476,688 times 346,029,140 equals 216,700. 79,189,578. 1,688,320. 606,900 times 8,986,334 equals 5,453,806,104,600. 13,383,056 times 257,586,844 equals 3,447,299,158,115,264. 60,000 times 24,520 equals 1,471,200,000. 5,061 times 580 equals 2,935,380. 138,360,402 times 220,523,826 equals 30,511,700. 65,215,938,000. 52. 99,002,177 times 728,702 equals 72,143,084,384,200. 54. 740,546,180 times 32,340,481 equals 23,949,600. 19,663,912,580. 754,084,700 times 781,308,700 equals 589,172,900. 36,646,890,000. 65,939 times 407,029,301 equals 26,839,105,078,600. 39. 100,309,307 times 701,009,000 equals 70,317,726,990. 1,763,000. 7,722,660 times 10,744 equals 942,492,259,040. 949,197,538 times 455,949,485 equals 432,700. 86,128,614,367,930. 90,048,387 times 8,940,400 equals 805,068,599,134,800. 874,790,322 times 508,897,631 equals 445,100. 78,722,400. 887,527,182. 443,047 times 370,706,302 equals 164,240,314,982,194. 8,909 times 609,510,077 equals 5,430,125,275,900. 93. 236,368,192 times 873,327 equals 206,349,500 8,908,398,784. 231,283,195 times 726,976,512 equals 168,137,450,385,300 15,840. 2,000 times 600 equals 1,200,000. 705,700,602 times 553,159,626 equals 390 quadrillion 365 trillion 81,070,294,852. 50,023 times 29,010 equals 1,451,167,230. 500,233,150 times 950,200 equals 475 quadrillion 221,592,546,630,000. 700,062,780 times 68,880,736 equals 48 quadrillion 220,839,532,606,080. 108,810,783 times 400,700,060 equals 43 quadrillion 600,487,200 76,746,980. 473,369,249 times 2,468,989 equals 1 quadrillion 168,743,468,719,261. 595 times 370,000 equals 220,150,000. 81,004,040 times 70 million equals 5 quadrillion 670,282,800,000,000. 540,458,050 times 489 equals 264,283,986,450. 57,508,309 times 66,457,636 equals 3 quadrillion 821,866,266,497,524. 103,702,925 times 78,644,823 equals 8 quadrillion 155,698,181,207,275. 83,248,537 times 2,455,293 equals 204,399,550,000,156,341. 563,117 times 846,972,572 equals 476,944,653,826,924. 428,321,490 times 393,465,632 equals 168 quadrillion 529,785,762,031,680. 2,834,429 times 459,063 equals 1,301,181,480,027. 2,229,755 times 97,869,542 equals 218,225,100,000,000 622,210. 8,000 times 50,265 equals 400,000,000 2,120,000. 2,790 times 17 million equals 47,430,000,000. 403,547,699 times 979,801,744 equals 395 quadrillion 396,739,267,387,056. 707,703,672 times 39,677,652 equals 28 quadrillion 80,020,000,000 16,738,144. 40,000 times 950,403,193 equals 38,16,127,720,000. 38,477,481 times 7,505,634 equals 288,797,889,627,954. 561,007 times 100,000 equals 56,100,700,000. 216,248,129 times 99,107,320 equals 21 quadrillion 431,772,520,204,200. 80. 466,771 times 604,507,150 equals 282,166,406,912,650. 235,922,642 times 76,239,450 equals 17 quadrillion 986,612,468,600. 26,900. 47,417,058 times 951,582,272 equals 45 quadrillion 121,231,783,195,776. 785,096,583 times 273,173,966 equals 214 quadrillion 467,947,271,158,178. 365,050,747 times 91,124 equals 33,264,884,269,628. 300 million times 874,178,977 equals 262 quadrillion 253,693,100,000,000. 5,019,075 times 868,535,111 equals 4 quadrillion 359,242,862,242,325. 9,700 times 19,960,919 equals 179,662,243,643,300. 150,606,610 times 804 million equals 121,87,714,440,000,000. 50,000 times 80,020 equals 4,001,000,000. 79 times 5,436 equals 429,444. 7,919,548 times 9,050 equals 71,671,909,400. 833,938,147 times 7,113,106 equals 5,131,890,437,054,500. 82. 487,809,566 times 904,088,225 equals 441,22,884,662,960,350. 8,337,474 times 6,369,516 equals 53,105,674,000,000. 42,584. 150,070,707 times 378,500,230 equals 56,801,797,115,762,600. 10. 73,527,430 times 642,620 equals 47,250,197,066,600. 5,070,014 times 2,600,947 equals 13,186,837,703,200. 58. 54,690,411 times 250,708 equals 13,711,323,560,988. 366,220,855 times 453,814,677 equals 166,196,399,022,400. 88,835. 52,994,205 times 25,037,928 equals 1,326,865,089,207,240. 76,134 times 16,488,482 equals 1,255,334,088,588. 1,070,068 times 408,030,000 equals 436,619,846,040,000. 9,882,620 times 312,381,121 equals 3,87,143,914,017,020. 388,794 times 56,086,526 equals 21,806,104,789,644. 54,380,722 times 429,748,369 equals 23,370,000,000. 26,584,542,400. 18. 8 million times 827,183,600 equals 6,617,468,800,000,000. 70,606,802 times 910,310 equals 64,274,077,928,000. 620. 862,279,597 times 210,565,619 equals 181,500. 66,437,093,375,543. 58,740 times 700,500,500 equals 40,629,547,370,370,000. 961,400,624 times 256,748,314 equals 246,800. 37,989,290,500. 47,936. 20,696,653 times 38,803,783 equals 803,108,431,000,000. 838,299. 908,215 times 150 equals 136,232,250. 8,066,837 times 259,737,693 equals 2,95,261,632,187,041. 9,152 times 7,577,658 equals 69,350,726,016. 44,356,543 times 706,380,365 equals 31,332,500. 91,034,478,195. 422,302,593 times 516,805 equals 218,248,091,500. 75,365. 921,262,859 times 215,376,673 equals 198,400. 18,529,529,888,107. 993,064,766 times 365,731,504 equals 363,100. 95,070,438,588,064. 388,995,120 times 92,683 equals 36,053,234,706,960. 70,062,738 times 253,161,621 equals 17,737,196,323,700. 78,298. 964,917 times 23,338,924 equals 22,520,124,500. 29,308. 60,009 times 50,020 equals 3,001,650,180. 7,107,004 times 167,656 equals 1,191,531,862,624. 7,312,543 times 819,385,174 equals 5,991,789,318,437,400. 770,539,040 times 95,572,774 equals 73,642,500. 53,528,096,900. 60. 6 times 400,000,000 3,007 equals 2,400,018,042. 30,096,113 times 721,236,402 equals 21,706,412,254,305,426. 60,000,000 times 680,000,040 equals 40,800,000,800,000,000 2,400,000,000. 510,201 times 2,050 equals 1,045,500,000,412,050. 991,935,119 times 249,459,363 equals 247,400,000,400. 47,502,923,069,197. 39,004,000 times 79 equals 3,081,316,000. 544,177 times 38,108,481 equals 20,737,758,800. 65,137. 496,764,992 times 40,766 equals 19,870,980,000,000. 201,983,872. 578,421,883 times 1,163 equals 672,704,649,929. 239,798,046 times 67,182,000 equals 16,110,112,300. 26,372,000. 384,484,584 times 91,567,700 equals 35,206,369,042,336,800. 130,700,080 times 43,034,556 equals 5,624,619,911,964,480. 400,056,380 times 4,303 equals 1,721,442,603,140. 55,060,059 times 721,700,200 equals 39,736,855,500. 92,311,800. 673,447,366 times 426,925,013 equals 287,511,525,484. 1,365,758. 70,006,010 times 600,000,000 equals 42,3,606,000,000. 35,332,371 times 419,389,312 equals 19,11,911,800. 85,018,752. 7,885 times 467,700 equals 3,274,313,914,500. 706,498,135 times 44,839,271 equals 31,678,861,336,259,585. 92,393,716 times 26,020 equals 2,404,084,490,320. 5,007,795 times 202,874 equals 1,015,951,402,830. 600,091,000 times 58,020,020 equals 34,817,291,821,820,000. 60,006,040 times 778,595,228 equals 46,720,416,395,177,120. 11,016 times 344,339,939 equals 3,787,744,838,439,024. 75,924,819 times 956,478,401 equals 72,620,449,473,334,400. 19. 785,079,550 times 77,310,407 equals 60,694,819,537,876,800. 50. 705,570,606 times 308,468,725 equals 217,646,465,230. 1,297,350. 31,043,300 times 400,000,000 equals 12,417,320,000,000. 32,664,087 times 685,932,279 equals 22,405,351,637,364,200. 73. 1 million times 3,050,073 equals 3,050,073,000,000. 769,122,587 times 918,668 equals 706,568,308,754,116. 683,907,200 times 34,502,580 equals 23,596,562,880,576,000. 94,010 times 8,545,999 equals 803,323,991,459,990. 810 times 792,920 equals 642,265,200. 18,583,374 times 4,327,447 equals 80,418,566,000,000, 66,178. 4,273,125 times 8 million equals 34,185,000,000. 500,000,000 5,000 times 4 million equals 2,020,000,000,000. 34,089,367 times 400,000,000 equals 13,635,746,800,000,000. 60,720,576 times 558,650,180 equals 33,921,500. 60,712,103,600. 80. 400,000 times 45 equals 18 million. 4,844,645 times 8,040,009 equals 38,950,989,401,805. 800,000,000 6,000 times 90 million equals 72,540,000,000. 89,324,872 times 6,496,205 equals 580,272,680,000,000. 110,760. 385,992,812 times 11,797,597 equals 4,553,787,640,872. 1,764. 600,693,020 times 4,060,485 equals 2,439,104,997,000,000. 314,700. 52,350,884 times 9,540,690 equals 499,463,555,469,960. 914,266,005 times 550,306,606 equals 503,126,600. 22,192,729,000. 101,808,955 times 29,424,927 equals 2,995,700. 21,068,821,200. 85. 784,425,271 times 939,690,365 equals 737 quadrillion. 116,869,221. 1,213,915. 524,335 times 173,003,700 equals 90 trillion. 711,895,039,000. 500. 800,400,000 times 900,007,108 equals 720 quadrillion. 369,689,243. 1,200,000. 200,273 times 60 equals 12,016,380. 640 times 32,006 equals 20,480,003,840. 48,931,820 times 585,090,000 6 equals 28 quadrillion. 629,518,800. 57,390,920. 480,750,112 times 36,544,418 equals 17 quadrillion. 568,700. 33,046,474,816. 100,790 times 8,700 equals 876,873,000. 9,579,100 times 911,609,868 equals 8,732,402,086,000. 558,800. 7,007,860 times 703,988,816 equals 4,933,455,064. 1,093,760. 90,007 times 869 equals 78,216,083. 51,110,738 times 751,255,154 equals 38 quadrillion. 397,205,347,243,652. 691,451,924 times 29,038,939 equals 20 quadrillion. 79,030,242,468,636. 215,658,780 times 63,218,142 equals 13 quadrillion. 633,500. 47,377,586,000. 760. 95,415,721 times 593,635 equals 56,642,111,535,835. 76,648,972 times 800,925,160 equals 61 quadrillion. 390,090,000,000. 162,935,520. 200,846,444 times 9,899,000. 2 equals 1 quadrillion. 988,179,350. 1,848,888. 700 million times 30 million. 8 equals 21 quadrillion. 5,600,000,000. 906,450 times 89,804,410 equals 81,362,835,871,984,500. 720,730,070 times 190,616,831 equals 137,383,281,949,808,000. 70. 8,903,005 times 29,278,825 equals 260,669,525,369,125. 130,002 times 70,080 equals 9,110,540,160. 300,010,000 times 347,120,098 equals 104,139,500,600,980,000. 957,365,752 times 8,212,349 equals 7,262,221,676,071,448. 85,595,820 times 322,935,606 equals 27,641,938,002,766,920. 227,197,465 times 200,003 equals 45,440,174,592,395. 18,050,200 times 200,600,006 equals 3,620,870,228,301,200. 148,049,864 times 18,370,000 equals 2,719,676,001,680,000. 75,942,269 times 937,460,026 equals 71,192,841,471,238,994. 744,983,525 times 837,101,317 equals 623,626,689,920,802,425. 13,507,025 times 300 equals 4,052,107,500. 746,544,869 times 721,480,032 equals 538,617,215,975,555,808. 5,076 times 246,681,348 equals 1,252,154,522,448. 706,580,448 times 117,101,773 equals 82,741,823,227,934,304. 8,933,989 times 430,050,001 equals 3,042,061,978,383,989. 994,825,730 times 214,284,204 equals 213,175,439,671,700. 768,920. 7,653,385 times 320,253,664 equals 2,451,024,588,252,600. 40. 600 million times 72 million equals 43,200,000,000,000. 44,008 times 364,872 equals 16,057,286,976. 9,204,656 times 11,515,840 equals 105,999,345,751,040. 213,639,381 times 569,288,523 equals 121,622,447,600. 64,124,263. 83 million times 6 million equals 498 trillion. 40,203,436 times 54,122,182 equals 2,175,897,000,000. 680,217,352. 979,068,600 times 320,460,007 equals 313,752,330,409,480,200. 86,160 times 573,773,475 equals 49,436,322,606,000. 620,999,092 times 4,930,503 equals 3,61,837,886,103,276. 45,394,280 times 71,090,430 equals 3,227,098,884,740,400. 50 times 959,024,477 equals 47,951,223,850. 76,601,015 times 804 million equals 61,587,216,060,000,000. 500 million times 10,090 equals 5,045,000,000,000. 64,317,418 times 8,621,499 equals 554,512,554,969,582. 80,049,804 times 631,004,000 equals 50,511,746,523,200. 16,000. 354,670,489 times 974,644,703 equals 345,677,713,400. 14,269,767. 800,870,001 times 270,040,250 equals 216,267,135,287,540,250. 17,560,451 times 744,317,610 equals 13,70,918,842,110. 35,879,956 times 781,870,000 equals 28,53,461,197,720,000. 500 million times 300,000 equals 150 trillion. 590,714,083 times 900,400,500 equals 531,879,255,690,241,500. 781,545,920 times 77,173,385 equals 60,314,544,179,300. 39,200. 446,717,777 times 81,552,460 equals 36,430,933,640,081,400. 20. 807,310,440 times 2,670,086 equals 2,155,588,303,497,840. 574,919,700 times 46,074,210 equals 26,488,970,990,937,000. 49,626,396 times 30,800,000 8 equals 1,528,493,393,811,168. 1,760 times 624,830,689 equals 1,099,702,012,640. 166,651,521 times 122,642,876 equals 20,438,621,825,200. 14,396. 28,079,406 times 14,609,800 equals 410,234,505,778,800. 73,633,407 times 498,125,076 equals 36,678,600. 46,458,013,900. 32. 306,040 times 16,092,685 equals 4,925,005,317,400. 652,710 times 4,860 equals 2,611,401,330,600. 755 times 138,642,711 equals 104,675,246,805. 1,941,336 times 10 equals 19,413,360. 472,946,965 times 40,098,610 equals 18,964,515,900,218,650. 26,874 times 757,280,094 equals 20,351,145,246,156. 672,472,565 times 604,342,733 equals 406,907,799,620,145. 30 million times 3,005,000 equals 90,150,000,000. 429,943,801 times 619,623,384 equals 266,403,232,905,400. 42,584. 301,215,909 times 74,872 equals 22,552,637,538,648. 60,031 times 80,062,088 equals 4,803,761,724,728. 463,058,000 times 243,004,190 equals 112,525,034,213,020,000. 209,062,354 times 486,015,921 equals 101,607,632,525,738,034. 29,676,129 times 92,200 equals 2,730,209,803,200. 25,800. 634,656,347 times 147,891 equals 93,859,961,814,177. 44,001,959 times 76,304,770 equals 3,357,559,361,044,430. 242,489,943 times 5,334,597 equals 1,93,586,122,457,971. 809,037 times 266,714,191 equals 215,781,648,944,067. 303,664,193 times 501,108,102 equals 152 quadrillion 168 trillion 587,399,591,686. 300,094,004 times 20,300 equals 6 quadrillion 1,970,108,201,200. 594,006,812 times 192,731,291 equals 114 quadrillion 483 trillion 699,739,500. 54,292. 650,787,810 times 7,040,400 equals 4 quadrillion 581 trillion 806,497,524,000. 63,978,625 times 400,907,000 equals 25 quadrillion 649 trillion 478,612,875,000. 7,007 times 5,211,300 equals 36,515,579,100. 201,742,846 times 119,875,501 equals 24 quadrillion 184 trillion 24,737,415,846. 627,353,879 times 90 million equals 56 quadrillion 461 trillion 849,110,000,000. 296,685 times 16,625,382 equals 4 trillion 932,501,458,670. 467,310,237 times 15,050 equals 7 trillion 33,019,066,850. 27 times 9,749,005 equals 263,223,135. 228,074,977 times 320,914,197 equals 73 quadrillion 192 trillion 498,099,748,469. 936,164,954 times 69 equals 64,595,381,826. 90,746,406 times 668,501,980 equals 60 quadrillion 664 trillion 152,088,883,880. 446,500,920 times 785,008,525 equals 350 quadrillion 507 trillion 28,620,343,000. 296,006,860 times 40,200 equals 11 quadrillion 840 trillion 333,601,372,000. 50,700,000 times 828 equals 41,979,600,000. 578,451,985 times 753,111,713 equals 435 quadrillion 638 trillion 965,300. 11,600,305. 747,425 times 813,422,137 equals 607 trillion 972,040,000,000. 747,225. 139,359,870 times 404,940,253 equals 56 quadrillion 432 trillion 421,015,847,110. 730,900 times 4,639 equals 3,390,645,100. 852,848,096 times 7,006,938 equals 5 quadrillion 975 trillion 853,700. 32,090,048. 960,405,078 times 816,952,966 equals 784 quadrillion 605 trillion 777,033,561,348. 391,473,097 times 209,081 equals 81 quadrillion 817 trillion 908,982,000,000. 320,857. 39,567 times 706,280,563 equals 27 trillion 945,403,036,000. 221. 200 million times 633 equals 126,600,000,000. 28,854 times 120 equals 3,462,480. 27,313,496 times 45,688,391 equals 1 quadrillion 247 trillion 909,684,824,936. 105,929,024 times 2,394 equals 253,594,083,456. 817,474,200 times 305,316,000. 2 equals 249 quadrillion 587 trillion 954,482,148,400. 12,200,510 times 31,159,645 equals 380 trillion 163,560,000,000. 418,950. 8,034,000 times 3 million equals 24 trillion 102 billion. 158,014,060 times 847,156,898 equals 133 quadrillion 862 trillion 700,909,985,800. 80. 42,213,084 times 75,452,712 equals 3 quadrillion 185 trillion 91,600. 69,683,808. 7,700,070 times 909,772,038 equals 7 quadrillion 5 trillion 308,376,000,000. 642,660. 400 million times 26,050 equals 10 trillion 420 billion. 171,787 times 390,300 equals 67,048,466,100. 54,812 times 64,684,453 equals 3,545,484,237,836. 6,215,341 times 99 equals 615,318,759. 7,000 times 297,701,511 equals 2,083,910,577,000. 153,598,221 times 60 million equals 9,215,893,260,000,000. 369,465 times 48,107,195 equals 17,773,924,800,675. 137,468 times 883,630,490 equals 121,470,916,199,320. 464,707,438 times 10,080,020 equals 4,684,260,269,188,760. 208,902,011 times 888,490,040 equals 185,607,356,109,470,440. 46,166,973 times 82,148,493 equals 3,792,547,258,321,600. 89. 321,955,648 times 562,128 equals 180,980,284,498,944. 8,080,456 times 25,756 equals 208,120,224,736. 2,055,166 times 186,471,922 equals 383,230,700. 54,049,052. 2,045,230 times 433,402,739 equals 886,408,283,800,84,970. 491,494,661 times 423,579,772 equals 208,187,196,445. 1,597,292. 800 million times 320,863,381 equals 256,690,704,800,000,000. 57,992,815 times 10,004,048 equals 580,162,904,915,120. 57,431,750 times 93,627,660 equals 5,377,200,362,205,000. 7,951 times 6,586,857 equals 52,372,100,007. 137,484 times 953,849,833 equals 130,677,888,784,319,172. 912,658,379 times 771,369,333 equals 703,996,685,066. 1,091,207. 700 million times 269,302 equals 188,300,211,400,000,000. 818,004,158 times 870,790,368 equals 712,310,100. 41,770,350,100. 44. 285,406,010 times 970,900 equals 276,844,086,565,409,000. 1,437,145 times 14,172,129 equals 20,367,404,331,705. 100,049,798 times 61,551 equals 6,158,165,116,698. 607,320 times 50,005,721 equals 30,369,474,477,720. 917,975,397 times 637,893,358 equals 585 quadrillion. 570,408,553. 1,713,126. 1,060,700 times 300,000 equals 318,210,000,000. 535,425,436 times 87,174,590 equals 46,675,000,000,000. 492,858,871,240. 40,298,070 times 5,005,019 equals 201,692,606,013,330. 600 million times 127,814,764 equals 76,688,858,400,000,000. 709,389,809 times 30,748,005 equals 21,812,321,300. 94,081,045. 80,001,007 times 2,621,446 equals 209,718,319,796,000. 122. 2020 times 82,003 equals 165,646,060. 308,016,607 times 600 equals 184,809,964,200. 817,446,120 times 60,037 equals 49,077,012,706,440. 149,159,264 times 8,050 equals 6 quadrillion to 793,316,569,963,200. 832,093 times 89,023 equals 74,075,415,139. 89,332,422 times 766,519,964 equals 68 quadrillion 475 trillion 84,895,472,808. 508,750 times 93,221,640 equals 47,426,509,350,000. 411,922,577 times 589,244,511 equals 242 quadrillion 723,117,400. 54,224,847. 375,520,092 times 201 equals 75,479,538,492. 762,701 times 602,002,300 equals 458 quadrillion 726,174,603,612,300. 280,000 times 100,008,000 equals 28 trillion 2,240,000,000. 32,755,733 times 8,300,010 equals 271,872,911,400. 57,330. 22,101,698 times 9,636,204 equals 212,976,470,000,000. 674,392. 387,124,483 times 600,003 equals 232 quadrillion 274,690,900. 61,373,449. 52,065 times 90 equals 4,685,850. 78,206,138 times 688,082,661 equals 53 quadrillion 812,287,000,000. 541,573,200. 18. 8,832 times 2,931,373 equals 25,889,886,336. 98,400,073 times 601,570,736 equals 59 quadrillion 194,604,000,000. 337,063,728. 934,341,025 times 589,590,302 equals 550 quadrillion 878,407,100,739,500. 50. 900,007 times 145,981,265 equals 131,384,160,300. 68,855. 911 times 8,283 equals 7,545,813. 6,224,342 times 14,907,218 equals 92,787,623,100,556. 5,930,235 times 71,592,319 equals 424,559,275,864,965. 394,292,808 times 48,935,692 equals 19 quadrillion 294,991,410,103,100. 36. 384,017,186 times 10,050,000 equals 3 quadrillion 859,372,719,300,000. 42,336,799 times 813,369,917 equals 34 quadrillion 435,478,688,675,683. 273,083,685 times 700 million equals 191 quadrillion 158,579,500,000,000. 705 million times 80 million equals 56 quadrillion 400 trillion. 466,933,582 times 710,440,600 equals 331 quadrillion 728,574,156,229,200. 526,940,206 times 701,756,630 equals 369 quadrillion 783,174,065,780. 177,159,181 times 35,913 equals 6,362,317,600. 67,253. 900,900 times 8,211,634 equals 7,397,861,070,600. 8 million times 923,177,000 equals 7 quadrillion 385,416,000,000. 65,008 times 32 million equals 2,080,256,000,000. 92,194,706 times 954,283,230 equals 87 quadrillion 979,800,000,800. 61,830,580,300. 80. 384 times 10,250,990 equals 3,936,380,160. 89,411,250 times 661,049,618 equals 59 quadrillion 105,272,657,402,500. 558,572,804 times 99,515,941 equals 55 quadrillion 586,898,207,068,564. 791,998,000 3 times 100,700,234 equals 79 quadrillions 754,384,229,632,700. 2. 490,000 5 times 331 equals 162,191,655. 54,956,833 times 809,170,056 equals 44 quadrillion 469,423,636,192,600. 48. 128,626,375 times 697,967,674 equals 89 quadrillion 777,051,773,801,750. 80,000,000 5 times 700,001 equals 56,083,500,005. 10,000 times 26,500 equals 265,000,000. 23,779 times 3,318 equals 78,898,722. 701,402,200 times 39,766,048 equals 27 quadrillion 891,993,552,505,600. 6,100,000 times 700,000,000 equals 4 quadrillion 270 trillion. 5,688,224 times 302,402,036 equals 1 quadrillion 720,130,518,824,064. 7,899,884 times 212,019 equals 1,674,925,505,796. 84,186,435 times 181,183,743 equals 15 quadrillion 253,213,403,126,205. 603,550 times 10,000 equals 6,035,500,000. 12 times 560,270,006 equals 6,723,240,072. 620,652,728 times 20,300,000 equals 12 quadrillion 599,250,378,400,000. 182,935,589 times 875,579,126 equals 160 quadrillion 174,583,100. 130,915,214. 900,000,000 8,001 times 207,045,000 equals 186 quadrillion 342,156,567,000. 45,000. 69,464,432 times 130,069 equals 9 quadrillion 30,380,953,045,000. 808. 930 times 82,900,000 equals 77,097,000,000. 224,595,658 times 932,006,620 equals 209 quadrillion 340,640,079,255,900. 60. 46,603,049 times 41,729,910 equals 1 quadrillion 944,741,040,495,590. 463,477,465 times 400,250,775 equals 185 quadrillion 500. 7,214,561,200. 85,375. 84 times 732,303,094 equals 61,513,459,896. 754,581,026 times 40,080,003 equals 30 quadrillion 243,609,785,823,078. 90,004 times 70,004,000 equals 6,300,640,016,000. 60,276,795 times 902,654,540 equals 54 quadrillion 409,100. 22,663,399,300. 6,335,518 times 771,378 equals 4,887,079,203,804. 248,634,804 times 345,485,181 equals 85 quadrillion 899,640,262,839,524. 924,457,451 times 319,348,605 equals 295 quadrillion 224,197,358,705,855. 142,329,592 times 671,987,658 equals 95 quadrillion 643,729,192,100. 75,536. 100,000,000 times 14,638 equals 1,463,800,000,000. 200,685 times 2,050,928 equals 411,590,485,680. 100,000 times 90,070,000 equals 9,007,000,000,000. 370,845,287 times 375,491,069 equals 139 quadrillion 249,093,249,241,803. 632,282 times 16,079,604 equals 10,166,844,176,328. 323 times 8,232,221 equals 2,659,007,383. 21,177,216 times 327,559,755 equals 6,936,803,684,542,080. 644,302,000 times 53,129 equals 34,231,120,958,000. 255,600,102 times 500,008,003 equals 127,802,967,616,306. 527,408,930 times 927,020,848 equals 488,919,73,531,372,640. 6,704,627 times 10,000,000 equals 67,046,270,000,000. 710,474,942 times 238,811,326 equals 169,669,462,988,793,092. 93,030,503 times 2,133,443 equals 198,475,275,411,829. 84,468,449 times 758,083,200 equals 64,34,112,100. 16,956,800. 936,509,190 times 800,700,906 equals 749,863,756,910,326,100. 40. 854,676,181 times 458,693,172 equals 392,34,128,495,700. 36,132. 178,019,006 times 6,543,583 equals 1,164,882,100. 41,338,498. 70,558,830 times 406,500 equals 28,682,164,395,000. 935,429,509 times 35,890 equals 33,572,565,078,000. 10. 864,943,197 times 133,259,382 equals 115,261,795,897,324,254. 344,777,343 times 877,582,683 equals 302,500. 70,625,707,551,269. 669,698,319 times 59,143,126 equals 39,608,052,062,605,194. 20,288 times 874,868,052 equals 17,749,323,038,976. 200,387,681 times 415,990,451 equals 83,359,300. 61,794,034,100. 31. 50,080,000 times 900,000,000 equals 45,072,000,000. 60,000,000 times 200,009 equals 12,540,000,000. 600,000 2 times 2030 equals 1,218,004,060. 29,441,899 times 154,531,345 equals 4,549,600. 96,251,824,155. 2,902 times 201,080,000 equals 583,534,160,000. 476,087,375 times 506,533,950 equals 241,154,418,603,881,200. 50. 90,010 times 7,060,000 equals 635,470,600,000. 681,827,645 times 73,269 equals 49,956,829,721,505. 148,016,250 times 938,550,724 equals 138,920,758,601,265,000. 150,825 times 5,010,000 equals 755,633,250,000. 90 times 40,100,020 equals 3,609,001,800. 5,011,684 times 600,089 equals 3,7,456,439,876. 863,496,847 times 3,569,442 equals 3,082,201,912,549,374. 755,291,709 times 93,531,133 equals 70,643,289,288,276,297. 420,859 times 790,020 equals 332,487,027,180. 710 times 86,777,215 equals 61,611,822,650. 13,962,438 times 501,800,000 equals 7,6,351,388,400,000. 13,389,667 times 6,206,547 equals 83,103,597,549,849. 4,131,785 times 8,860,654 equals 36,610,317,287,390. 420 million times 3,800,009 equals 1,596,3,780,000,000. 85,625,135 times 343,642,471 equals 29,424,432,971,108,500. 85. 640,510,106 times 59,231 equals 37,938,054,088,486. 667,400,003 times 5,240,101 equals 3,497,243,400. 23,120,303. 100,229,610 times 420,605,051 equals 42,157,080,200. 25,760,110. 7,021,055 times 300 million equals 2,106,316,500,000,000. 925,894,490 times 645,828,050 equals 597,968,632,982,400. 44,500. 537,080,051 times 42,897 equals 23,039,122,947,747. 103,104,149 times 623,462,244 equals 64,281,544,101,250,356. 54,700,002 times 458,819 equals 25,097,400,217,638. 276,246,669 times 945,540,160 equals 261,200,000. 2,319,605,727,040. 580,730,618 times 330,037,039 equals 191,662,613,621,360,100. 2. 672,636,420 times 220,900,406 equals 148,585,000,000. 658,268,386,520. 704,277 times 415,972,145 equals 292,959,600. 14,364,165. 44,376 times 169,114,125 equals 7,504,608,411,000. 73,776,441 times 7 million equals 516,435,087,000,000. 4,400,000 times 20,027,680 equals 88,121,792,000,000. 3,039,088 times 121,482,755 equals 369,196,782,000,000. 927,440. 40,086,000 times 400,500 equals 16,34,420,043,000,000.